So I always say, that when I am helping people learn how to pitch, it is because of the amount of failure I've had. And I often say that, I was cleaning my Mac. I found some like 255 versions of my initial pitch. And it took me
Wow.
18 months, a lot of versions until I raised the first money.
My guest today is Ayman Ashour. Ayman is someone I have a great pleasure to host today because he's kind of like a godfather for the ecosystem. He's a wise, experienced voice, and calm attitude, especially in these turbulent times, is a help to many startups. He's a person who's very generous with his time, very generous with his experience. I have, tried that myself, and I'm very grateful for it. So, without further ado, welcome, Ayman.
Thank you, Ali. It's a pleasure to be with you. It's really nice that you're doing this, and thank you for hosting me.
So maybe we can start with you telling us the story of how you came into the world of startups.
Well, I always tend to sort of divide my career into three phases. The first phase is, childhood education, etc. So from 0 to 20 or thereabout, coming out as, graduate in electronic and electrical engineering. Then the 20 years after that was really being immersed in the corporate world. Mostly large companies working in a specific industry, the security industry. And it is, soup to nuts in the security industry, from access control systems to physical security to safes to guarding to cash in transit to gold in transit, many facets of the security industry. And then the 20 years after that was mostly focusing on the RFID industry. And that's where I started getting much more active in the world of startup. So I broke out from the corporate world in 2000, and that's when I started Newton International, which started as a consulting business, mainly focusing on valuations, mergers and acquisitions, and the like. And from there, started focusing much more on RFID, and then started my own company in the middle of a big financial crisis, 2007, 2008. And so it was, sort of not dissimilar to what we're at now. And then pretty much left that world. As I always say, I transitioned from having my own vision to enabling other people's vision around 2015 or so.
Okay. So, I mean, first of all, it sounds like the security world. I mean, you probably have incredible stories. So we'll probably circle around to that. Incredibly interesting stories. But yeah, firstly, I might just uh, continue where we just left off, which is starting Bluehill ID after such a successful long career in the corporate world. I mean, in the middle of a financial crisis, you decide to risk everything and found the company. How did you make that decision?
Well, it was really, I was engaged, as I told you. I had my consulting business, so I was engaged by Assa, Abloy, the people who own HID, and Yale, and all of these products, in 2003, to do a number of acquisitions for them and to uh, integrate them and manage them. So from 2003 till 2005, I was essentially acting as CEO for what they called Identification Technology Group within Assa Abloy. And I loved the strategy that I originally devised for them was backward integration. So rather, they started out. HID was an offshoot of Hughes, so it was Hughes identification devices, Hughes aircraft. So, and then it was spun out and then eventually acquired by Assa Abloy. My view then was to integrate downwards into the process of manufacturing the cards and the readers. So it was moving back into the silicon stages and into the sort of making of the antenna, making of the cards, making of the transponders, making of the readers, all of that. So we got from being an access control provider of cards and readers to being a technology provider. And when we went this step backwards, all of a sudden you look at the RFID technology and you see so many applications. Not just access control. You see applications in payments, applications in border control, in passports, applications in authentication of products. Sort of a whole host of driver licenses, car ID, object ID. So the whole sort of like the genesis of the Internet of Things really was with that, sort of. I'm not claiming I invented it, but that was really seeing that opportunity. So I wanted to basically start an RFID business that is focused on the technology, but addressing multiple verticals. So I had the vision of, an industry not dissimilar to semiconductors itself or aluminum that's addressing multiple verticals, and that was the thing that I wanted to do. So I started really from 2005 actively fundraising, and it took quite a while. I ended up starting the company in 2007. So I always say, that when I am helping people learn how to pitch, it is because of the amount of failure I've had. And I often say that, I was cleaning my Mac. I found some like 255 versions of my initial pitch. And it took me
Wow.
18 months, a lot of versions until I raised the first money.
So let us double click on that. 250 versions of the pitch. So I would assume you pitched more than 250 times.
Yes, yes.
Oh, yeah, over 2 years,
Uh,
and
uh,
in the end, yeah,
Over an 18 months period, and got into term sheets, got into investment committees, got into handshakes. And, I remember flying from Boston to Munich to Dusseldorf in the middle of the World Cup in Germany to meet a partner at one of the large, private equities VCs in Germany. It's an American company, but this was the guy who was focused on this area of the industry. And then getting there and getting a message from his secretary that apologizing that he actually had to go to New York the day before. So it was a lot of expenses, a lot of sort of disappointments, a lot of picking yourself back up, by your bootstraps to get yourself remotivated.
yeah, it must have been. How did you manage your psychology at that time?
Uh, I don't know. I always say that if it wasn't for running, I would have gone crazy. So I think sort of like running was something that helped save my sanity. Having a very supportive family, my wife and my kids were very supportive and felt very well anchored. So and that helped. And also I think I want to say also it's probably it is excessive self-confidence bordering on arrogance or probably well into arrogance. I was completely convinced I'm right.
Yep, yep. So I mean, belief in the vision. I mean, I guess that's core to it as well.
Very, very, very much so. It was I could see it, I could smell it, I could, and it was something I felt very strongly about.
Yeah. And shout out to the spouses out there for founders who are married, who are supportive, because this is really something that's underappreciated. The amount of kind of anchoring, as you put it, that one needs at home. I've also had this experience, and I just want to highlight it because I don't think many people realize it or give it
Absolutely.
enough, credit. Um, so I mean, ultimately over 250 pitches, but all you needed at the end was one or two yeses, right?
Absolutely. Yes.
Yeah,
And
yeah,
once you get to that, things start moving much faster after that.
yeah. So I want to go back to something you said like a minute or two ago, which is that you saw the vision as this one technology that could be used in many verticals. And this kind of why it clicked with me is it makes sense to me that RFID is like that, but then that goes against the advice that a lot of people founding companies have, which is focus. Focus on one thing, focus on one niche, make it very small, etc. At first, and then think about and then see what happens, so to speak. So, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, the this is exactly what I was getting, and I would be in a pitch, talking about access control, animal ID, e-passports, payment, gaming applications, you know, uh, and you will see people saying, "But that is just too many verticals," and I used like one of the analogy I told you is that is a single industry addressing multiple verticals. For maybe the first 100 pitches, I used to address it differently. I used to say I'm like an elevator, and each floor has its own rules. So here's a floor of animal ID. Here's a floor that have this. Here's a floor that have that, and it wasn't resonating. But one of the people I was giving the presentation to said, "Oh, you mean really multiple verticals? It is not that you're a vertical, you got different horizontals. No, you're a foundation, you're a base, and you got multiple verticals." And it was somebody who actually rejected the opportunity, but helped me a lot by giving me very coherent feedback. He's the one who said, you're like a foundation industry. He said, you're like the plastic industry, the aluminum industry, where yes, aluminum industry, you got the same production, same technology, but then you can have airplane parts, or you can have bottles or cookware or saucepans, so it was so that was really helpful. So I then had to spend a lot of time explaining the synergies in the technology and why that synergy would end up giving me USP in the different bits and pieces. And
Right.
it was really all about taking the identification bit from all these different industries and unifying it.
Yeah. Yeah. And shout out to the VC who gave you good feedback, unlike many VCs. And shout out to the founders who actually listened to the feedback and incorporate it into their vision and keep evolving, because you really need that to succeed in the fundraising process, I think.
Absolutely. I mean, it was two different things were happening at the same time. On the one hand, I had a core vision that remained the same. On the other hand, I pivoted so much that and changed so much of my thinking as the whole process went. And you keep saying, no, I'm still believing in the same vision, but in reality, no, the vision evolved. So it evolved a lot based on the feedback and based on the rejections and based on the level of interest and all of that.
Yeah. It's kind of one of the invisible positives of this whole process of fundraising being so painful.
Yes, yes, yeah.
Yeah.
I
So,
always make a comparison, Ali. Sorry to interrupt you, but
no, no, go ahead.
it's a little bit, like in the US when people run for elections, when you spend sort of like a guy who wants to be a congressman, or wants somebody wants to be a president. He spends 2 years campaigning to do the job. So it was spending 2 years fundraising to do the job. So,
Yeah, yeah.
and it prepares you. If I just finished listening to Jimmy Carter's book, the one he wrote when he reached 90, and you hear the story of how he evolved during the campaigning process and how he learned during the campaigning process. So,
Yeah. And it goes to the concept of, being an infinite learner and always learning, always improving.
absolutely.
So speaking of learning, you had become very successful in the corporate world. Corporate world has a way of working, and the startup world has a pretty different way of working. And probably the more you learn about operating the corporate world, the more you need to unlearn, or the more things or mistakes you might or fumbles you might make. So, what were the biggest learnings as you made this transition? What's different?
Well, in my corporate world experience, the first 10 years was very insular, North American, US based industry. And then it was all of a sudden just became a really global business for me. I changed companies and ended up in a global role. And my role very quickly evolved into being working with the companies that the holding company acquired into integrating them. So I was basically, the guy who was trying to make sense of the post acquisition of all of these different startups, different small to mid sized businesses, and integrating them into the big company. So I've learned a lot of what not to do because I've seen a lot of mistakes, and I've seen sometimes when sometimes we acquired very nicely well-run startups and we integrated them. Sometimes we acquired companies that grew, but then were badly managed and needed a turnaround. So sometimes it was that I've learned from, look at this company, it's so good, but why has it become so poorly managed? And this was all over the world. A lot of it was in the US, some was in the UK, some was in France, Germany. So it was the process of learning, and you're talking about some really competent people, but things went astray.
Yeah, but and when you actually made the startup come to life, so to speak, what were there still things to be learned? Were there still surprises you found, and how it's different from what you had at the very, very
Oh,
early stage of
oh,
starting
of
something?
course. Of course, because when I left the corporate world, I was running a $500 million business with, sort of uh, maybe 50,000 employees between China to South Africa to Holland so it was, you get used to a certain dashboards, you get used to certain controls, and all of a sudden you're on your own.
Yep.
So it's a very different world. And one of the things you also learn is the issues of values and morality and how important they are, because all of a sudden you're the person who is going to be really projecting or influencing a whole culture. So certain things that you could do that were expedient to do in the corporate world um, became a no-no. It became a self-imposed no-no. Um, and you became just much more aware of how important your actions and your style and your truthfulness. There is no more white lies. There is no more, trying to make things look better than they are. All that stuff that you do in the corporate world, you don't do anymore.
Yeah. So years later, Bluehill ID merged with two other companies, and Identiv came to life, and you became the CEO. How did you decide that
Right.
this merger was the right path for the companies? And how did that discussion start?
Well, it was, it was really Blue Hill ID. We were getting very strong in the RFID side of things, and the RFID and smart cards were merging because you started getting more intelligent ICs, more intelligent RFID, more secure. And so if you look at the e-passports projects, e-passport is basically a smart card with an RFID interface.
Yep.
So it was natural to start wanting to get more expertise in that area. And I've always, sort of had a lot of respect for SCM. In fact, it was not a new company to me. I knew it, and this a merger with them was a very sensible thing for us to do because we were quite strong on the transponder side, and then became, sort of strong on the smart card reader side. And when you think of the really central things to me at the time were things like e-passports, we were trying to supply the inlay that goes into the passport, and SCM were already supplying the readers that read the passport. So that was sort of a lot of the logic of it.
Yeah. And did you approach them, or did they approach you?
Uh, I approached them, and I have approached them over many years, and from well before I even sort of started the company. So one of the advantages I had is I knew the industry very well, and I knew the players in the industry, and I was reasonably well known in the industry. So
Right. And I guess there are challenges in merging any companies, and you have a lot of experience in that across your career. What, how big were the two organizations, and how did you go about the merger? And
um, the two, I think they were of similar size, and they were probably a bit bigger, and because they were listed on Nasdaq, and we were listed
already,
on the Frankfurt Stock Exchange, so we had done a spec, in Frankfurt, and they were listed on Nasdaq and Frankfurt. So it ended up really being what's known as a reverse acquisition or reverse merger. So we were sort of took on the sort of the leadership, the executive management, and but it was very collaborative. The people there and us were working very closely together.
all right. So, not all mergers are created equal. So, what makes a merger value adding, and when does it turn out to be value destroying, in your opinion?
Well, it is it all boils down to that elusive word synergy. So
Mm,
if you have, I'll give you, I used to actually have a presentation on the type of synergies. So I'll give you an example of a positive synergy. When you were talking about like e-passports, for example, okay, you're basically selling to the same product from both ends. So if you unify your sales force on that, you just have more things to sell to the same customer, and they are largely synergistic. You then have because SCM had the technology for reader manufacture in smart cards, then you can try to go into a broader reader market. So not just the readers that are used that plugged into a computer, but the readers that gets plugged into other applications or standalone. So, and similar on the other side, where you now have the transponders. So you exploit relationships. You also exploit locations. So that's, does that make sense at all?
Yep, yep. Um, Somebody's strong in one geo, and the other company is strong in another geo, and
Right.
you
So you
leverage
basically had
both.
really this three entities where you had Hirsch Electronics, which was, access control in the USA, mainly with the biggest customer being the US government. You had SCM, which was card readers broadly around smart cards, but global with a
Hmm.
good global infrastructure. And then you had Bluehill ID, which had the transponder side of the business and some of the system integration. And so that was the theory of it made sense.
Right. And what about taking a company public? Obviously, you started a private company, and then you took it public. I didn't know it was a SPAC
Yeah.
before SPACs were fashionable.
Yes.
Yeah. So, how did managing the company change after going public? And what was the right time for you to go public? What made you make that move?
It was really at the time the decision to go public and to do a spec was mainly influenced by the investors. The most of the investors, it was right in the middle of the crisis, the 2008 banking crisis. So the issue of liquidity was a big issue. So going public, it means that people, you didn't have restrictive shareholders agreements, you didn't have any of that. So people, put their money, put 2 million euro, $2 million, and they got, the right number of shares, and then they can trade them, they can get in and out as much as they want. So that
Mm,
what drove that decision. And the problem was it was too premature.
mm,
So it was always, so in retrospect, I wish I'd never done it,
never.
because yes, absolutely, because when you're building something, being public is not really helpful, because when you're building something, you're making acquisitions, there are lots of costs, there are things that go right, things that go wrong, and in the meantime you've got this whole demand to be the public face of the company. And my own ability to manage the job, especially once we became listed on NASDAQ, I found that I'm spending disproportionate amount of time on the public company side and investors and investor relations and all of that, much more so than the things that really needed to be done.
Right. And that kind of highlights the fact of also the choice of investors themselves, whether they can wait it out until you're ready to go public, so to speak, and or what type of I mean, whether they have the same vision to build towards with you, and they can have that stamina with you.
Right, right. And I guess part of it is my own startup was a is a and the word startup is really has to be used loosely, because it was a combination of a vision of that had specific product vision and acquisitions. So
Right.
it had a roll-up element and an acquisition and a startup element, and the
Hmm.
two combined, and that made it, sort of more complicated. So the roll-up, you could have done it all day as a public, would have been fine, because you wouldn't be investing a lot in new technologies and a lot of development. But
Yep.
so we're trying to do both at the same time, and that was really public was not the best environment for that.
Got it. So, Ayman, you mentioned the importance of values, morality, ethics for startups, especially, and these times as we speak, these are very uncertain, very tough times we're going through right now. The public markets. We're recording this episode as SVB just blew up. Credit Suisse. We have this just borrowed over $50 billion from the Swiss central bank. Public markets are not doing so great. So, how does one lead with integrity in difficult times and not just good times?
Well, the it really, I believe it's sort of, you don't have much of a choice, because I often think of somebody who immigrated at a relatively young age, to the US. And I look at some of the things that I have done when I first went, when I first moved to the US, and I feel ashamed of myself because I did a lot of things, pushing and shoving and, trying to make it. And you then get to a point where you say, do I want this culture in the company that I'm building? What do I want the company that I'm building? How do I want to be viewed by my subordinates? How do I want to be viewed by, we got to a point with Bluehill ID or Identiv, being 500 people or whatever. How do I want the new hire to be thinking of me? So it's a little bit of leading by example. So you really sort of become um, much more aware of that responsibility, of the message, of how do you want how do you want your customers to perceive you? Do you want your customers to perceive you as somebody who exaggerates, who lies, or somebody who has integrity? And you try to get that as part of the DNA of the company as a whole.
Yeah,
So it is simple things like, I used to, whenever we're in a discussion or something and I discover I'm wrong, I used to go out of my way of saying, hey guys, I'm wrong and I'm wrong and blah, 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 blah. And own up to my mistakes in detail, because I wanted to get people to see that this is okay,
yeah,
that this is a culture that admits mistakes and, moves on with it. And that was important to me.
yeah. I think it's just so important to act out the values you want. If you want your team to work hard, you have to work hard. If you want them to be honest to you, you have to be honest to them. If you want them to own
Yeah,
up to their mistakes and learn from them, you have to do the same.
yeah,
That's the only way actually to do it.
yeah. In the big corporate world, you always have, we talked about synergy. Synergy is basically business unit cooperating with another business unit. So the end of every month, if you didn't meet your targets in a big corporate world, the really important thing was to be able to blame it on somebody else.
Yeah,
So I wanted to send a clear message that that is not what we wanted to do when it came to sort of extracting synergy. And that's why
yeah,
wanted to be much more open about mistakes.
yeah. So you recently wrote about the importance of a founder being perfectionist. You know, but how do you balance that idea with the need for speed and the idea, of move fast and break things, that is also being told to founders?
Uh, and I didn't necessarily say that the founder has to be perfectionist. I was really talking about, if you're a perfectionist, which I consider myself, to be, you have this challenge of how do you balance scalability with perfectionist. That's
Right,
exactly the point you're saying, and it becomes a real obstacle to growth, fast growth, and scalability, to find people who share these values. And what I was trying to get to people to get across is that you really need to build your perfectionist attitude in your workflow, in your process, because the really tricky thing to grow quickly is to be able to get Mr. and Miss Average and make them successful.
right,
So it is really, so it's being a perfectionist is not by employing an army of perfectionist people, but by having a process that values the high degree of perfectionist performance, but having the average people do it. So
Right.
so that was the message I was trying to get
Yeah.
across.
Yeah. A- and how does that? There's a tension there as well between that and the advice to always hire A plus players and people who of that type. So, is it more important to have an A plus process or A plus players? Because A plus players, they don't like to be constrained with processes as much.
The answer is both. If you have a choice between A class and B class, hire A class. But in a tough economic environment, with finance being difficult, financing being difficult, to be successful, you need to be able to grow with the B player, with the C player. And of course, if you can get all A players, great, but quite often you can't. So that becomes an obstacle against your scalability.
Yeah. It kind of goes to, in the early days, you probably need very strong, very people with initiative, and at the same time, you probably can't afford them. So
Yeah,
it
but
becomes
yeah,
really, yeah, I
please
was going
go.
to say it becomes really important to recognize talent, the
Yes.
potential to be great
Yeah.
players in the field, so to speak.
I mean, if you take, for example, Apple stores, okay, you go to an Apple store, you almost have the same experience in Apple stores in
Yep.
Singapore, in the US, in Canada, in the UK, in Germany. You almost have the
Mhm.
same experience. Not all the people in these stores are A players, but you
Yep.
always get the impression that they are, but they are not.
Yep. Hmm. And that takes a lot of effort on the back end, in the background.
Right, right, and the process and the values and the
Yeah.
message that you're sending and the culture of accepting blame, all of that. So that's really the best example I can think of.
Yeah. Yeah. It's a great example. So, zooming out a bit to the regional ecosystem, what do you think are the biggest opportunity that's not being addressed aggressively enough in the region for startups?
The what I feel is that there is a big confusion in the region, in the Middle East or the Arab speaking region, uh, uh, between what is an exitable business and what is a good small medium sized business. What business should be going to a private equity versus what business should be going to a VC.
Mhm.
And this is really the issue. And I think part of the problem is exasperated by the VCs not finding enough companies, so they invest in things that they shouldn't be investing in.
Mhm.
So uh, so and you don't have enough private equities going after the market. So this is part of the biggest single issue that I see, um, affecting the region, is the lack of private equities, because we have a lot of really really good businesses that are not exitable, that can generate very nice returns, pay dividend, grow, being good solid mid-size
Yep.
companies, but will not give you the sort of returns that a VC is looking for. And in terms of valuation, the founder should be getting 10-15%, not 90%, because it's a PE model rather than a VC model.
Okay. So, I mean, that's, I think, a big challenge for the region. Uh, are there any startups that you think should be being created, or any industries in which startups should be created in the region, but you don't see enough activity there, or not enough people addressing that?
Uh, there are lots of things that you feel lacking. I think one of the biggest areas that I see, and if I can talk about Egypt in particular, for example,
Sure.
is the manufacturing industry, the hardware manufacturing industry. Egypt has done a good job of establishing itself in the IT industry and as a supplier of labor and skills in the IT. But if you look at the amount of engineering graduates in Egypt, in mechanical engineering, electrical engineering, electronics, you have a lot of skills, but you it's very hard to import components. There is no the ability to prototype a circuit board in Egypt is almost nil. Uh, at Identiv, we had an engineering center in India, and we at first they were doing mostly software and firmware. And over the years, we started doing more and more hardware, and then more and more hardware being designed in India, more and more hardware being manufactured or at least prototyped in India. This is a really big problem, and this is not just in Egypt; it's in the entire region. And you can't have a turnaround of a circuit board anywhere in the Middle East in 24 hours. In a week, in 2 weeks, you have to send it to China, and you have to, or Singapore, or wherever, to get something back.
Right.
So packaging industry, molds, all of these things, all of the industries that the manufacturing where so these are issues that I think act as impediments to the economic growth as a whole, and they are in the same time real opportunities.
Right. So going to the investment side of your story, so to speak, how do you evaluate investments? What makes you think I want to invest in a company?
The founder.
The founder.
That's
What about the founder?
it is really being excited about the founder, being excited about the founder, um, the talent, vision, drive, perseverance, ethics, all of the stuff.
Hmm.
So that would be that for me is the first thing. You and I, before we started, were talking about the app I'm using with the live thing behind me and Phil
Yep.
Libin, etc. One of the things I learned from Phil when he started on the investment side, he said to me, he said, there are two kinds of investors. Investors who see an idea and they get really, really excited about it, and they imagine themselves running this idea, running this company, doing it. And there are other investors who get excited by the founder and sort of look at the founder, he or she, and imagine them running their old business. So, so it is, so I'm very much the latter. And
Right.
because I've learned that ideas change, visions change, pivot and repivot and pivot from the pivot, times 10.
Right.
So what's really, really important is the founder.
Yeah. Yeah. I would tend to agree. So, does everyone, like in investing? I'm sure I mean, you've seen a lot of companies. Everyone has big misses when it comes to investing. What's your biggest
Has what?
miss? Big misses,
Oh,
things you
oh,
missed.
uh, lots. I have misses all the time, and I think, probably, and when people say I have no regrets, no, I have regrets as well, So, so it is, yes, but you move on.
Yeah,
You just
of
have
course.
to you keep moving on, and as long as you're uh, winning more than you're losing, or you're occasionally winning enough to make up for your losses, that's great.
Yeah. Um, Yeah, I mean, and I think if you're not missing some good companies or great companies, you're probably not seeing enough great companies.
Exactly.
Yeah. Does anything like come to mind in that area?
Uh, I try not to remember. So
All
no,
right.
I mean there are lots of really great opportunities, but sometimes I have like one of the things, having spent most of my career in the security industry, I tend to be much more focused on the other side of the Maslow hierarchy of needs. Because if you think of the Maslow hierarchy of needs being the biggest, your first need being physical safety, so that's
Yep.
security. I tend to be focused much more on things like entertainment and games and content. And that's why when you had your startup and we were talking about it, I was much more interested in that sort of thing.
Yep. Yep.
So it is really the thesis just change.
Interesting. So, uh, being a startup founder is incredibly stressful. Yeah, even on the day you fundraise, that means you have only 18 to 24 months before you're uh, going bankrupt, basically. So, how do you think founders can handle the mental stress of it, or because I've seen you speak recently about that as well.
Yeah, you know, it is first of all you gotta accept and you gotta recognize that the stress doesn't end at any stage. It actually increases.
Yeah.
So you might be very stressed until you get your first money. Well, wait, when you get the first money and you start getting more and more, the stress becomes much harder. And I remember at some point I was doing a fundraising and we were already public, but we were trying to do a pipe and it was fundraising. And the amount of stress I was under was, incredible. Part of it is how do you deal with it is number one, acknowledge it. Number two, you need to send positive message to your team during that stress.
Hmm.
So you need to project confidence and positive, and you need if you start looking defeated, your whole team will be defeated.
Yep. Yep.
So it might be that you're being torn up on the inside, but outside you have to be positive.
Right.
uh, and the other thing for me is sports. It is
Hmm.
things, and it is vigorous sports. It is running, long distance running. It is sort of weightlifting. Anything that you're exerting so much effort, and not a gentle walk. You need to exert so much effort that it washes you, because
Yeah.
you only if you only when you're exerting so much effort that your brain eases, you stop dwelling, and it enables you, it tires you out so you can actually sleep better.
Hmm.
So
Yeah.
I don't know if I'm answering your question, Ali, or,
No,
or not, but
everybody
how,
has
how
their
would you
own ways, and
how would you answer the question?
oh yeah,
Because
yeah. I think mentally, what you tell you, what how you speak to yourself mentally, that's you need to kind of almost take pressure off yourself. Uh, I'm also for sports. I think it's very important. I know that uh, the week I don't play, I like to play football, for example. The week I don't play football is a more stressful week. But also, yes, weightlifting and all that is important. But I also think walking and clearing your mind and is also important. So all these things factor in, and really just being consistent at not using stress as an excuse to abuse yourself by eating bad food, or not doing sports, or not spending some time with your family and all that. Sometimes we just it just we abuse ourselves, so to speak, by saying I'm stressed, I'm stressed, I'm stressed, and just your self talk really makes a big difference.
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, and you know, to what you were just talking about, maybe I could follow up on that about communicating. We founders with the team. You were just mentioning that, and founders need to communicate a lot, both internally and externally. So, what do you think are the best practices for founders? I mean, who should know the bad news, for example?
I
Things
there
like that.
is I wouldn't hide the bad news. So transparency would be one of the values that you would want to have. So and whenever if people perceive you to be in denial or not understanding the problems, that will project negatively on you. Then you
Exactly.
become delusional, not positive, but delusional.
Yep.
So you need to acknowledge it, and but you you can have a very difficult situation, but still be positive about it and positive in your ability to prevail.
Yeah. Exactly. So.
And if you're not positive in your ability to prevail, this is the time to bail out.
Mm. Yeah. So kind of double clicking on that, it's kind of acknowledging the challenge and communicating to the team and rallying the team around solving the challenge rather
Right.
than ignoring it or not. Yeah.
Absolutely. Like one of the things that when I'm helping people with their pitches, one of the things quite often people say, well, this VC told me blah, 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 these problems. So I said, well, you should acknowledge them. Yes, these are legitimate problems, because the fact that you also see them as a problem, so acknowledge it and explain how you're dealing with it. And if there are uncertainties, identify these as uncertainties.
Yeah.
But rather than because you're not going to convince the VC that these are no problems, especially when you know they are.
Exactly.
So be proactive about it, because when people see you worrying about things they are worried about, they worry less.
Yep. Yep. And they trust you more.
Exactly. If you're talking to a subordinate about doing something and they articulate to you exactly all the things that you're worrying about it, you'll say, all right, well, they know what they're doing, so I'll leave it in their hands.
Yep.
So you need to do more of that.
Absolutely. In good times and bad.
Yeah.
Um, So another thing that's kind of happening these days in the region is that the cash rich countries in the region are attracting startups from the less cash rich countries or in the region, and then many people are actually making the move, and we're seeing that in the ecosystem a lot. What are your thoughts on this?
Well, I think a country like the UAE created a very good sort of infrastructure for startups, and the infrastructure is in starts with the legal infrastructure. So you have things like the DIFC, and you have the ability to have work in Dubai or in the United Arab Emirates under laws that are different from the laws of the country, which is basically, so you've got a whole body of laws and a whole system you can be operating under, your agreements, your shareholders agreements, all of that. A lot of the shareholders agreements that are written in other countries are not applicable because the laws in these countries have not caught up with them, whether it's Egypt or Saudi or Jordan, etc.
Yep.
So this is so the UAE has done that. The UAE has also done a good job with things like immigration and ownership and all of that. Uh, I think the move in Saudi is obviously huge, but I think it's also premature. I think we can now look at UAE and see over a number of years, a lot of really, really good companies that have been built there and are operating regionally, if not globally. Yeah, but with Saudi, it is premature. It is going to be uncertain. Can you get people into the country or not? Do you have enough skills? I understand the Saudization laws and the need to have more Saudis in the workplace, and I don't blame them at all for doing that. But that can be an obstacle to a startup,
Right.
because when you're a startup, you need to you need to balance your resources very carefully, and you need to get the people that you need and that you're comfortable with. But being forced to hire X number of different nationalities, etc., is problematic. So I would it's wonderful that a country like Saudi Arabia is doing that, but I'd like to see more time. The other thing is, I don't know about the laws in terms of shareholding and passing shares and inheritance laws and all of that. I think all of that stuff is addressed fully in a place like the UAE, but not yet in Saudi. And,
Hmm.
but we'll see.
Yeah. But for example, the UAE people kind of say the market is much smaller, so you don't have that many consumers. Versus, of course, a country like Egypt, for example, or even Morocco, and definitely Saudi. The market yeah, is just by definition bigger. Um, how would you think? I mean, should companies be where their market is, or where their team is, or where the legal infrastructure is?
Well, it is companies. Uh, I tend to look at startups and business in isolation from the concepts of patriotism and religion.
Yeah.
So companies should be where it makes the most economic sense for them to be. So
Right.
when it comes, so their headquarters should be in the place where it is easiest to to have applicable legal agreements, easiest to have bank accounts, easiest to transfer money in and out, easier to have tax authority, etc.
Hmm.
So that is the first thing. Now, if I'm selling into Egypt or Saudi Arabia, you may need to have a sales company in that
Hmm.
country, or you may need to have a dealer in that country. But so that's a different question mark.
Right.
The technology and the development, if it is easier to develop and more cost effective to develop in Egypt or in Jordan, then you should have a subsidiary or an operation center in that country that's doing that.
Right.
So it really is. You need to be looking at each of these questions
Aspect.
and
Yeah.
select, yes, each aspect and selecting the right thing.
Right. Okay.
And
You were going to say something?
yes, so I think coming back to Egypt specifically,
Hmm.
if you're setting up a company and you have global ambitions, you can't set you can't make the legal headquarter and the banking relationship in Egypt,
Yes.
because it is going to be, once you get the money in, it's going to be hard to get the money out.
Yeah.
And if you're sending people out, how do you deal with the tax authorities? How do you have to get things translated? If you're setting up a subsidiary company, if you're making an acquisition, so you need to have, it's where it is simpler. But if you're
Yeah.
setting up a business that is mainly going to be selling in Egypt, then yes, set it up in Egypt. Great.
Got it. Yeah. So let me move to the quick fire questions where I ask a quick question that can have a quick answer. The first one is, what book do you like, or books do you like to recommend to others?
Mostly about Arab-Israeli conflict or theology is what I read.
Interesting. So any specific books?
The book that I've actually finished reading and I enjoyed a lot is a book called In an Antique Land. It is written by an Indian American called
Hmm.
Amitav Ghosh. and he spent a lot of time in Egypt, learned to speak, excellent Egyptian, even Bahira dialect.
Interesting.
And the book is about alternating between his history in Egypt in the 90s and the history of a Jewish, Tunisian, Egyptian um, guy who immigrated to India in the Mamluki era.
Interesting.
And the documents of that guy found in the Cairo Geniza documents, and he was doing research on that. And you discover fascinating things like the naval battle between Egypt and Portugal in the 1500s off of the coast of
Yeah.
India.
In the Red Sea,
And
right?
no,
Or
no,
or what?
off of the coast of India.
India.
In the
Wow,
Yeah, in
never
the
heard of that
Arabian
one.
Sea. Yes, yes, yeah. That really marked the end of the Arab and Muslim trade with India and
Right.
the beginning of the European control.
Got it.
It's
Yeah.
15 something, you know.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Interesting. So, who do you think we should have as a guest on the podcast or guests,
Uh, I More founders, uh, more founders.
for
I think
example?
you should. I don't know Ahmed Assam
Yeah.
if you had Ahmed Assam. Ahmed Assam was F16 apps, and he currently works for Apple.
Mm-hmm.
So he's excellent. You could have people like Iman Hailuz from Abjad,
Mm-hmm.
from Jordan. You could have people like the Ayman Ismail, if you have not had him, from the
Yeah.
AUC.
AUC.
I,
Yeah.
Ayman Ismail is wonderful because he sees so much, and he's got a great handle on the ecosystem. Um, there are lots and lots of people who can tell you things from different angles.
Yep. Yep.
So that's really it's just different. There are lots of fascinating people, and you want to get people who you should have yourself, because you have, you'll be surprised, but I still remember what you're doing. I still remember the IP discussions. I still remember the two sides of the activity, the photo ID and the social network and all
Yep.
of
Yep.
that. So you should have yourself, because what you had was, very, very interesting.
Okay. Well, maybe I'll have you host me then at some point. So, another quick fire. What question should I have asked you that I didn't?
uh, what's wrong with your eye? Because I'm not seeing you.
Yeah.
No, I just had surgery on my eye, so I'm not looking,
Yeah.
as you know. But
Yeah.
no, I
Very well.
think this has been really very, very pleasant. I hope you will have good material out of it.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And how can people reach you if they want to get your advice or talk to Newton about investments?
Uh, First of all, I don't offer consulting services to startups. I don't make money out of startups. When I am, I'm not looking for. What I always do is basically I have clients that tend to be in the large
Yep. Yep.
companies. That's who I generate money for, and I
Yep.
invested into startups. So people can reach out on Facebook or Twitter or Quora. I'm very
Hmm.
active on Quora as well. But the main thing is I always ask that people be very clear what you want. And if I can help answer anything, I will. If I can't, I won't. So,
Yeah. And I can vouch for that. That if you can help, you
mm,
always do.
mm,
And
thank you.
that's very much something I'm grateful for. And I like to close the podcast on a note of gratitude. So, my final question is: what is a gift someone has given you that has had a large effect on you, a positive effect on your life?
Oof. I guess it would probably be my wife. Just sort of the level of trust and friendship and camaraderie and support would be the main thing. So sort of like I don't recognize the person I was before I met her. Sort of. So I think that would probably be uh, the biggest thing in terms of business. I've been fortunate enough to meet many people who have been sometimes better than I have been. So you just you meet lots and lots of people, and you're you'll meet some people who will be horrible, but the vast majority are good people.
Absolutely. That's a wonderful thing to end on. And thank you very much. I'm grateful as well for your time, and hopefully we'll have that upended episode soon with you interviewing me.
Sounds good.
All
Will
right.
be my pleasure. All right, Ali.
Thank
Take
you,
care.
Ayman.
Pleasure.
Bye. Thank you for listening to this episode of Startups Arabia podcast. If there was something you really liked about what the guest said today, reach out to them on social media and tell them what you liked. And of course, if you haven't subscribed yet, what are you waiting for? You don't want to miss any of our great upcoming episodes. Also, please rate us and give us comments on our social media accounts so that we know how to improve. And also tell us what you like. We don't mind hearing that either. Until next time, this was your host, Ali's Whale.